We're in the middle of a sermon series. It's called Give It Up. The sermon series about giving. And that's why we read that passage from Leviticus. There were all sorts of things there that they were supposed to give. You know, we talked last week about how everything we have truly belongs to God. And that when we go to spend some money, for example, we need to ask the question, is this a good use of God's money? Would God want me to spend God's money this way? And today we're going to talk about how much we're supposed to give. Or more accurately, we're going to talk about how we decide how much we're going to give. When we talk about that in terms of the church, it seems like one of the first things we always think about is tithing, giving 10% of our income to God. Now, I don't know how many of you tithe. I'm sure there are some here who do. I'm sure there are some here who don't. Is it a salvation issue? No, it's not. We're saved by God's grace and love and mercy and through our faith in Jesus Christ as our Savior. We're not saved by how much we give. God's not up in heaven with a green eye shade looking down at us going through our books to see how much we've given and to see if that measures up. It's not how this works. So, if it's not a salvation issue, do we really need to tithe at all? After all, giving a tithe, giving 10%, that's a legal standard. You know, we went through all of that Old Testament law in Leviticus that God gave through Moses. That's a legal standard. And, you know, the coming of Jesus supposedly set us free from the law. So did the coming of Jesus free us from needing to tithe? Well, yes and no. As I said, it's not a salvation issue. We don't need to tithe in order to be saved. But I still think tithing is a good thing. Wanda and I do it, and I think everybody should. Why? Because tithing holds us up to a standard. Tithing sets a measure for us. It sets a bar for us. Tithing is one way of measuring how much faith we actually have in God. You know, I understand why tithing is a hard thing for most of us to do. Wanda and I tithe now. There were a lot more years of our lives when we did not tithe than there were that we have. And the main reason that we did not tithe is probably one of the reasons lots of people don't tithe. We did not think we could afford to do it. You know, we were not making a lot of money. We had a lot of bills we needed to pay. We had a lot of expenses. We simply did not think we could afford to give 10% of our money to the church. But what Wanda and I were doing when we looked at it that way, really, was looking at it backwards. We were looking at all the bills we had to pay, all the things we needed to buy. Then what we were looking at is what was left over after we paid all of those things. We were determining our giving based on our leftovers. And that's probably the way a lot of people do it. And again, I'm not saying you're committing a sin if you do it that way. That's not the point. But it's really not the way that God tells us to do it. God does not tell us to give out of our leftovers. God tells us to give out of our first and our best. The first fruits, not the leftovers. We read that passage from the book of Leviticus today. And again, we don't read Leviticus very often, but look at what it said. God tells the people they are supposed to take the first grain they harvest and give it to God. They're supposed to take the best livestock they have and give it to God. They're supposed to take the best flour, the best wine, the best bread. They're supposed to take the first and the best of everything they have and give that to God. So why would God do that? Why would God tell us to give the first and the best of everything? I mean, it's like what we said last week about money. God does not need it. God has no need of anything that we have to give. God created it all in the first place. So why would God tell us to give it? I think one of the reasons we're supposed to give God the first and the best is so that we learn to trust God. I think that's one of the things that it's all about. Because think about it. If we take out all the money that we think we need first and just give to God out of what's left, what are we doing? We're saying we really don't trust God to give us all that we need. We really don't trust God to take care of us. We need to take care of ourselves. And so we do. We take everything we think we need, and then if there happens to be some left over, we'll give some of that to God. Again, it's giving to God out of our leftovers. And we don't do that because we're terrible, horrible people or anything. That's not the point. It's not that we're such awful sinners. We do it because we're scared. We do it because we're scared that if we give to God first, if we give to God out of our best, there won't be enough left for us. Giving to God out of our first and out of our best shows that we trust God. And that's what we show when we tithe. We're showing we're willing to take 10% of our money off the top and give that to God. And we're showing that we're willing to trust God enough that when we do that, God will make sure that there's enough for us. You know, this was not any easier for the people of Israel to do thousands of years ago than it is for us today. When they gave to God out of the first of the crop that they harvested, they did not know what the rest was going to be like. In fact, there were all kinds of things that might happen to that crop. And that it was possible a storm would come up and wipe it out, just like it's possible for that today. Possible that there'd be something else that happened. There'd be some disease or something that happened to it. There are all kinds of things that can happen before you get the crop in, and most of you know that. It was the same with the animals. If they gave the best of their animals to God, that had the potential to really hurt the herd. They did not know if the next animals would be as good. They did not know that a disease would not wipe out their herd. Again, all kinds of things that could happen. But still, they did it. I'm sure not all of them did. There were probably some who did not trust God enough to do that. But a lot of them did. And God blessed the nation of Israel because of it. And God will bless us too if we trust God enough to give our first and our best to God. But it is hard. And I know it is. I've been through that. I know what it's like to have that stack of bills sitting there and not know how you're going to get the money to pay for them all. When that's the situation, it's hard to even think about taking 10% of our income and giving that to God. In fact, sometimes it's hard to find any money at all that we feel like we can give to God. So here's what Wanda and I did. Now, this is not my original idea. In fact, I'm sure some of you have heard this before. But this works, and I know it works because it worked for Wanda and me. At the time we started thinking about this, Wanda and I were giving about 1 to 2% of our income to God. And statistically, that's about average. That's about what most people give. It's about 1 to 2% of the income. So what we did was say, okay, for the next year, we're going to raise that up to 3%. We'll give 3% of our income to God. And if we can make it by doing that, then fine. And if not, then we're going to go back to doing what we were doing before. We were not trusting God a whole lot, but we decided to trust God enough to just raise our giving by 1%, from 2% to 3%. And that's what we did for the next year. And God came through. We always had enough. Not much extra a lot of times. In fact, usually not a lot extra. But we always had enough. There were times when we wondered about that. We wondered if maybe we should cut back. It was very tempting to cut back. But we went through with our part of the deal, giving 3% of our income to God. And it worked out. We always had enough. So the next year, we said, okay, we'll try 4%. Raise it 1 more percentage point. Again, we still reserved the right to cut it back if this was not working out. We still had not made a total commitment on this. But we were willing to trust God a little bit more. And we gave 4% the next year. And again, God came through. We always had enough. Again, not a whole lot extra. Again, there were times we were tempted to cut back, times where we wondered if we were going to have enough, but we kept at it, and it worked out. We always had enough. So the next year, we went to 5%, and the next year to 6%. Now you'd think at some point I might have trusted God enough to say, well, let's go all the way to 10. But I did not do that. We kept doing it 1 year at a time, and 1% at a time. And so obviously it took several years to get to where we were actually tithing. But we did it, and we've been doing it for several years now, and God always comes through. We always seem to have enough. Again, not always much extra. And then we still get tempted to cut back sometimes. But somehow, it always works out. We always have enough. And so that's what I would invite you to do. Figure out what percent of your income you're giving to God, whatever it is. And for the next year, just increase it by 1%. Trust God that much. If that does not work, you can go back to what you're doing. But trust God that much. Trust God enough to give God a chance. And if God comes through, then increase it by 1% more the next year. And if God comes through again, increase it again by 1% more. Because I predict that God is going to come through. Not saying you'll have a lot extra. I'm not saying this is the way to get rich. Not saying you won't be tempted to cut back sometimes. Not saying you won't have some struggles. But I predict that if you stick with it, things will work out for you just like they did for Wanda and me. You'll always have enough. And by the way, we're not required to stop when we get to 10%. That's not a cap. That's not a ceiling. We're allowed to continue to trust God even more and give a higher percent. Go beyond that if we want to. But try it. See what happens when we stop giving God our leftovers. See what happens when we give God our first and our best, because that's what God deserves. God deserves our best. God does not deserve our leftovers. God deserves our best. So let's try giving that to God. Let's trust God. Because my experience has been that God always comes through. Amen.